The first glyph lit before Dr. Marin Calloway even touched the wall. She pulled her hand back, fingers still curled from reaching toward the carved stone, and watched a thin line of gold thread itself through the groove she'd been about to brush clean. The light moved like liquid, tracing a symbol she didn't recognize from any catalog she'd studied in 31 years of fieldwork. It pulsed once, then held steady, throwing a warm glow across her dust-caked knuckles. Behind her, the dig chamber went quiet. The generators hummed. The portable floods cast their blue-white glare. But the 23 people working the Valkyrie excavation on the southern shelf of Primus Tertia had all stopped moving, all stopped talking, all turned to look at her. "Nobody move," Marin said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Her heartbeat was doing something unreasonable against her ribs. The wall was enormous, 20 meters tall, carved from a stone so black it swallowed the floodlights and gave back nothing. They'd been clearing sediment from it for 6 weeks, working down from the surface of the plateau, where the original ground-penetrating radar had flagged an anomaly dense enough to confuse the instruments into returning a solid mass reading. The Valkyrie Governance Authority had approved the dig permit reluctantly. The southern shelf was sacred ground to 14 different species, none of whom agreed on why, and all of whom insisted nothing should be disturbed. Marin had pushed for the permit anyway. She always did. In 3 decades of digging alien ruins across the outer corridor, she had built a reputation as the person you called when something was too old to categorize. She'd excavated the Tessarine burial mounds on Keth, the collapsed transit halls under the Dreven Sea, and the vitrified tower stumps on Pelos 4 that turned out to be 60,000 years older than any known civilization in the sector. None of them had glowed at her approach. The glyph's light intensified. A second line began to trace itself through the stone, branching from the first like a root system pushing through dark soil. Dr. Calloway, Hendon Voss, her site director, was standing at the base of the scaffold platform, looking up at her with both hands gripping the rail. His face had gone the color of old chalk. "Step back from the surface." "I'm not touching it." "You're within half a meter, step back." She did 1 pace, then 2. The light didn't care. A third glyph lit, then a fourth. The branching line spread outward from the point she'd been reaching toward, climbing the wall in both directions, and the stone surface began to hum at a frequency she could feel in her teeth. Marin had spent her career studying dead things, ruins, fragments, the cold remains of civilizations that had burned bright and then gone dark before humanity's ancestors had figured out fire. Every artifact she'd ever cataloged had been inert, dormant. A puzzle of dust and mineral decay that she could reassemble with patience and careful hands, and the kind of stubborn focus that had cost her 2 marriages and most of her friendships. This was not inert. The humming deepened. The glyphs kept spreading, hundreds of them now, racing up the wall in spiraling patterns that had no analog in any script she'd ever documented. The portable floods flickered. One of the generators coughed, surged, and then every light in the dig chamber cut out simultaneously. For 3 seconds, the only light in the cavern was the wall itself. Gold, deep, liquid gold, radiating from every carved line on the surface, bright enough to throw shadows behind the scaffold towers and the equipment cases, and the 23 people who stood frozen in its glow. The chamber filled with a sound that wasn't sound, something that pressed against Marin's chest and settled behind her eyes, and made her think of a door that had been locked for so long that the hinges had fossilized. Then the generators kicked back on, and the floods blazed to life, and the gold light on the wall dimmed to a steady, patient pulse. Marin realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out, slow and controlled, the way she'd taught herself on digs where the ceiling might not hold, where the next layer of sediment might be hiding a pocket of toxic gas, where the only thing between her and a very bad day was the discipline of keeping her body quiet while her mind screamed. "Get me a full-spectrum scan," she said. Everything we have. Electromagnetic, thermal, acoustic, molecular. And somebody wake up Dr. Tessara. She's going to want to see this. The chamber erupted into motion. Marin stayed where she was, on the scaffold platform, 3 meters above the floor and 2 meters from the wall, watching the glyphs pulse in their slow, steady rhythm. The light was warm on her face. The stone smelled like ozone and something older, mineral dust, geological patience, the particular scent of rock that had been sealed away from air for a span of time her instruments might not be able to measure. She pulled her field journal from her vest pocket and began to write. Habit. 31 years of habit. The pen moved across the page in her tight, precise hand, cataloging what she'd seen, what she'd felt, what the instruments needed to confirm. The date, the time, the ambient temperature which had dropped 4 degrees since the glyphs ignited. At the bottom of the entry, she wrote a single question. What did I almost touch? Dr. Tessara arrived within the hour. Omi Tessara was the expedition's xenolinguist, a slight woman with steady hands and a memory that bordered on eidetic, and she stood at the base of the wall for a full 3 minutes without speaking before she said, very quietly, "This isn't Valkyrie." Marin, standing beside her, nodded. She'd already suspected as much. The Valkyrie civilization had been dead for approximately 9,000 years, and their architectural style was well documented: low arches, hexagonal chambers, script that ran in tight horizontal bands. This wall was none of those things. The glyphs were vertical. The chamber was circular, and 9,000-year-old ruins did not light up when you reach for them. The script doesn't match anything in the unified archive, Tessara continued. She was running her fingers along her tablet, pulling up comparative databases, her face lit blue from below. Not Valkyrie, not Driven, not Tessarine, not any of the 17 pre-spaceflight civilizations documented in this sector. Dr. Calloway, I don't think this wall belongs to any species on record. How old? I need a core sample to date the stone, but based on the mineral composition readings we're getting from the surface scan, Tessara paused, swallowed. The preliminary estimate is somewhere north of 200,000 years. The number landed in the chamber like a physical weight. 200,000 years. The oldest confirmed ruins in the outer corridor were the Pelos Towers, at 62,000. Before that, the record was held by the Kethian burial mounds at 48,000. 200,000 years ago, most of the species now spacefaring hadn't yet developed agriculture. That's not possible, Hendon said from behind them. That's what the readings say. Tessara's voice was flat, professional, the voice of a scientist reporting data that terrified her. I'm requesting a second instrument. Marin looked at the wall. The glyphs pulsed. The gold light was patient, rhythmic, almost organic, like breathing, like something that had been asleep for 200 millennia and was now slowly waking up. She pulled out her journal and wrote, "It's older than everything, and it's not dead." Hendon organized a security cordon around the wall within the hour. Nobody was to approach within 3 meters without Marin's direct authorization. He posted 4 of the expedition safety officers at the scaffold base and sent a priority message to the surface camp requesting additional monitoring equipment. The message never made it out. The comms array had gone dead the moment the glyphs ignited. Not damaged, not jammed, simply dark, as though every wireless frequency within the cavern had been quietly smothered. Hendon discovered this when his field radio returned static on every channel, and the backup satellite link showed a signal strength of exactly 0. "We're cut off," he reported to Marin, his jaw tight. "Every outbound channel dead." The wall. What else could do this? Marin looked at the pulsing gold lines, at the humming stone that had swallowed their communications with the same quiet certainty it had swallowed the floodlights. Whatever the wall was doing, it wasn't hostile. The expedition team was healthy. The air quality readings were normal. The ambient radiation was actually lower than surface baseline. but it was thorough. It had sealed them in with the efficiency of a system designed to control the environment around its activation sequence. She sent a runner to the surface, a young Tessarine field assistant named Kelly's, who climbed the 40-meter shaft in record time and came back 20 minutes later with wide eyes and a single devastating sentence. "The shaft is sealed, 20 meters up, same material as the wall. I could feel it humming through my boots." The dig chamber went quiet for the second time that day. 23 people, underground, cut off from the surface, sealed inside a chamber with an artifact that was 200,000 years old and actively doing things they couldn't predict. Marin absorbed the information the way she absorbed every field complication, with a slow breath, a mental recalculation of variables, and a refusal to let fear outrun data. The wall had sealed the chamber. It had killed their communications. It was controlling the environment around its activation sequence with the precision of a machine designed to manage exactly this moment. "Felk," she said, turning to the expedition's Drevany geologist, "air recyclers, how long do we have?" Felk's 4 eyes blinked in their nervous sequence. "At current consumption rates with 24 people in the chamber, 72 hours. He paused, rechecked his instrument panel, and his expression shifted from anxious to confused. "But Dr. Calloway, the atmospheric readings haven't changed since the shaft sealed. Carbon dioxide should be climbing. It isn't. Something is maintaining the air supply independently of our recyclers." The wall was breathing for them. Marin felt the first real spike of fear, not the manageable professional caution she'd carried all day, but the deep, primal recognition of being inside something alive, something older than comprehension, something that had decided to keep them. She mastered it, she'd mastered worse. On Pello's 4, a tunnel collapse had buried her team for 31 hours before the rescue boar reached them. On the Dreven Sea expedition, a submersible pressure failure had left her breathing recycled air in a space the size of a closet for 4 hours. She had survived those situations by staying methodical, staying calm, and trusting that the evidence would point to the way out. The evidence here said the wall was keeping them alive. That was data. She could work with data. "All right," she said. "We're sealed in with a 200,000-year-old artifact that appears to be managing our life support. We work the problem. Tessara, focus on the script. If this is an instruction set, I need to know what the instructions say." Felk, continuous atmospheric monitoring every 15 minutes. Hendon, inventory our supplies, set a rationing schedule on a 72-hour basis. Everyone else continues documentation. Stay calm, stay professional, and stay away from the wall unless I say otherwise. She paused, then added, "Nobody panic, we're archaeologists, we've been buried before." A few strained laughs, not many but enough. Over the next 4 hours, the wall continued its slow awakening. Every 30 minutes, a new section of glyphs would ignite, not the explosive cascade of the initial activation, but a methodical, sequential illumination, as though the wall were running through a checklist. Each new section produced a subtle change in the chamber's environment. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees. The air pressure increased by a fraction of a percent. The ambient electromagnetic field shifted in ways that made Felk's instruments produce readings he'd never seen before. At the 2-hour mark, the wall emitted a pulse of light that wasn't gold. It was blue, a deep, cold blue that swept across the chamber like a searchlight, touching every person, every piece of equipment, every surface. It lasted exactly 3 seconds. When it faded, Felk reported that the pulse had been a comprehensive scan of the chamber's contents. "It cataloged us," he said, staring at his readout. "Every biological organism, every piece of equipment, every material composition in the room. It knows exactly what's in here." At the 3-hour mark, the wall began to produce heat. Not dangerous heat. The surface temperature rose from ambient to approximately 32 degrees Celsius, which Felk noted was precisely average human core body temperature. Marin felt the warmth like a hand pressed against her chest from 6 meters away. The non-human members of the team reported no equivalent sensation. The heat was directional, targeted. It was warming the space for her, specifically, adjusting the environment to keep one species comfortable while a 200,000-year-old system completed its startup protocols. Hendon watched the temperature readings climb and said nothing, but his expression said everything. They were not guests in this chamber. They were components in a process they didn't control and couldn't stop. The core sample confirmed Tessara's estimate within 4 hours. 217,000 years, plus or minus 8,000. The stone itself was not native to Primus Tertia. Molecular analysis identified trace elements that didn't exist in the planet's geological record compounds that Felk said he'd only seen in deep core samples from neutron star debris fields. This stone was quarried from something that shouldn't exist as a building material, Felk reported, his secondary hands trembling as they adjusted calibration dials. It's been machined at a precision I can't replicate with our equipment. Whatever carved this wall did it with tools we don't possess. Tessara worked the script for 6 hours straight without a break. She identified 642 distinct symbols, organized in a radial pattern spiraling outward from a central point approximately 4 meters above the chamber floor. The pattern had internal logic, recurring sequences, nested structures, a language. These sequences here and here and here, she said, highlighting sections on her tablet's holographic display. They repeat at regular intervals, always in the same configuration. In linguistic analysis, that pattern typically indicates a conditional statement, an if-then structure. If what? Hendon asked. That's what I can't read yet, but the structure suggests the wall isn't a monument or a historical record. It's an instruction set. A set of conditions that, when met, trigger a specific response. Marin studied the spiraling script and thought about the glyph that had lit before she touched it. The wall hadn't responded to contact. It had responded to proximity, to her proximity specifically. She tested it, methodically, the way she tested every hypothesis in the field. She asked Tessara to approach the wall from the left, walking slowly toward the stone while Marin watched from the scaffold. Tessara walked to within arm's reach, close enough to lay her palm flat on the surface. Nothing happened. The glyphs pulsed at their steady baseline rhythm, indifferent to her presence. She asked Felk to try. The Drevany geologist stretched one of his secondary arms toward the stone, held it there for a full minute. Nothing. She asked Hendon. Nothing. She asked Kelly's. Nothing. She ran through every member of the team, human and non-human alike, watching each of them approach the wall with varying degrees of courage and caution. The wall ignored them all. Not a single glyph brightened. Not a single line extended. Then Marin climbed the scaffold and walked toward the surface, and the glyphs brightened before she'd crossed the 2-meter threshold. The branching gold lines reached toward her like roots seeking water. The humming deepened. The stone grew warm enough to feel the heat radiating from 3 feet away. 23 people watching. None of them said a word. Marin wrote in her journal, "It knows me. I don't know how, I don't know why, but it knows me and it doesn't know anyone else." She spent the next hour examining the wall's base, where the carved stone met the chamber floor. The junction was seamless, not mortared, not joined, but grown, as though the wall and the floor had been poured from the same pour of liquid stone and allowed to set as a single continuous piece. She found near the floor on the western edge a section of carving that was different from the rest, smaller, more delicate. While the main glyphs were clearly functional, the conditional instruction set Tessara had identified these smaller carvings were decorative, representational. She recognized the format from 100 other archaeological sites across the corridor. It was a builder's mark, a signature. The builder's mark depicted a figure, bipedal, Bilateral symmetry, five-fingered hands. The figure was shown from behind, arms extended, palms pressed against a curved surface, a wall or a door, and from the surface, lines of light radiated outward in a pattern that Marin recognized immediately as the same spiral pattern that covered the main face of the wall above her. The figure was human. There was no mistaking the proportions. The shoulders, the stance, the shape of the hands. 200,000 years ago, a human, or something indistinguishable from a human, had carved a self-portrait into the base of this wall. A portrait of someone doing exactly what Marin had done, reaching for the stone and watching it respond. She stared at the carving for a long time. Then she photographed it from 6 angles, measured its dimensions with a laser caliper, and wrote a detailed description in her journal. At the bottom of the entry, she wrote, "The builders looked like us, exactly like us. This changes everything we think we know about human evolutionary history." Then she underlined the word everything twice, which was something she had never done before in 31 years of field journals. That night she went back to the wall alone. The dig chamber was empty except for the monitoring equipment and the steady hum of the generators. The work crews were in their bivouac shelters at the far end of the cavern, sleeping or pretending to. Marin climbed the scaffold in the blue-white glare of the floods, her boots quiet on the metal grating, her breath visible in the cold underground air. The wall waited. The glyphs had been pulsing steadily since their initial activation, but as Marin reached the platform and stood facing the stone surface, the rhythm changed. The pulse quickened. New lines began to trace themselves through the carvings, branching from the existing pattern, reaching toward the edges of the wall that hadn't yet been fully excavated. The gold light brightened, and the humming returned, deeper than before, resonant, like a chord struck on an instrument built for a cathedral. Marin stood still. Her heart hammered, her hands were steady. She was a scientist. She had spent her life in the discipline of observation, of measurement, of careful inference from physical evidence. She did not believe in destiny. She did not believe in chosen ones. She believed in stratigraphy and carbon dating and the patient, methodical work of understanding what the dead had left behind. But the wall was not dead, and it was responding to her, only her. She lifted her hand. Slowly, deliberately, the way she'd lifted tools over fragile artifacts 10,000 times before. A small, detached part of her brain cataloged the absurdity of the moment. 63 years old. Standing alone on a scaffold in an underground chamber on an alien world, reaching toward a wall that was older than human civilization, that had sealed 24 people underground, that had demonstrated capabilities beyond any known technology, and that was, according to every test she devised, responding exclusively to her biological presence. Any rational person would have waited for backup. Any sensible expedition leader would have called for a robotic probe, a remote sensor, a mechanical arm that could touch the surface without risking a human hand. But Marin had never been sensible in that particular way. Careful, yes. Methodical, absolutely. But there was a difference between caution and cowardice, and she had spent her career on the line between them, making the judgment calls that other archaeologists wouldn't make, reaching for the artifacts that other teams left sealed. It was why she was here. It was why she'd always been here, at the edge of what was known, with her hand extended toward what came next. She extended her fingers toward the stone. The gold light flared. Every glyph on the wall blazed at once, so bright she had to squint against it, and the humming became a tone that filled the chamber and pressed against her skull and vibrated in her bones. The stone's surface rippled. Not cracked, not shattered, rippled like water, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single dropped pebble. The ripple spread outward from the point directly in front of her hand, and where it passed, the wall changed. The glyphs rearranged themselves. 200,000 years of carved stone shifted like type on a page being reformatted, lines sliding, merging, separating, until the spiral pattern that Tessara had mapped was gone and something new had taken its place. A single column of symbols, running from floor to ceiling, pulsing with a light that was no longer gold but white. Pure, clean white, like starlight, like the first light of a sun clearing a horizon on a world that hadn't seen dawn in geological ages. And at the center of the column, at exactly her eye level, a single line of text that she could read. Not because she recognized the script, she didn't. But the meaning arrived in her mind fully formed, the way a word arrives when you've been trying to remember it for hours, and it suddenly surfaces, whole and certain and unmistakable. Architect of the threshold. The words hung in her mind like a bell struck once and left to resonate. She stared at the glyphs that carried them, and she understood not intellectually, not through analysis, but with a certainty that sat in her chest like ballast that the wall had been waiting. Not for a species, not for a civilization, not for any of the 14 races that had declared the plateau sacred ground without knowing why. It had been waiting for someone specific. For someone whose hands had spent 3 decades learning the patience of stone, the grammar of ruins, the vocabulary of things that endure. For someone who knew how to listen to what the dead had left behind, because the dead weren't dead. They were dormant. And dormancy, in Marin's professional experience, was temporary by definition. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the scaffold. Hendon, because of course it was Hendon. He stopped at the top of the stairs and stared at the wall, at the column of white light, at the rearranged glyphs, and she watched his face cycle through every expression a rational man could produce when confronted with the impossible. "It spoke to you," he said. "Not in words, but yes." "What did it say?" She told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then, with the careful pragmatism that made him the best site director she'd ever worked with, "What do you want to do?" "I want to find the door." The door was already opening. The column of glyphs shimmered, and the stone surface behind them began to recede. Not crumble, not break. The wall pulled itself apart at the molecular level, stone flowing like slow water, opening a passage that hadn't existed since before any civilization in the known galaxy had drawn its first breath. At the same instant, Hendon's radio crackled to life. Kelly's voice, breathless. "The shaft is open. The stone blocking the surface access has dissolved. Comms are back. I'm getting full signal on every channel." The wall had released them. Whatever activation sequence had required isolation was complete, and now the system was moving to its next phase. Marin felt the shift in the chamber's atmosphere like a change in pressure, not physical, but functional. The wall had been evaluating, testing, making certain that the person standing before it was the person it had been designed to wait for. It was certain now. Marin looked at what the wall had revealed. A passage. Beyond it, a chamber so vast that the floods couldn't reach the far wall. She could see the outline of something in the darkness, a shape, massive, rising from the center of the space like a mountain in a cave. And around it, spreading across the floor in concentric circles, glyphs. Thousands of them, already beginning to glow. "All teams to the primary chamber," she said into her comm. "Full documentation kit. Every scanner, every camera, every recording device we have." She waited for them at the threshold. She could have gone in alone. The chamber beyond was already glowing, already waking, already preparing itself for her, but she waited, because this was not a solo act. Whatever she found on the other side of this wall was going to change the galaxy, and the people who witnessed it deserved to see it from the beginning. They gathered behind her. Tessara with her tablet, Felk with his instrument cases, Hendon with his quiet competence and his list of supplies, Kelly's with eyes still wide from watching the shaft unseal, the safety officers, the surveyors, the documentarians, the Kethian observers who had said almost nothing for 6 weeks and who now stood at the back of the group with expressions that suggested they understood, on some ancestral level, what was about to happen. 23 people, human and alien, scientists and support staff, individuals who had signed up for a routine excavation of a 9,000-year-old Valkyrie site and were now standing at the entrance to something that predated every civilization in the known galaxy. Marin looked at them. She owed them something honest. "I don't know what's in there," she said. "I don't know what it does. I don't know why it responds to me and not to any of you. What I know is that it's been here for 200,000 years. It's been keeping us alive since the moment it activated, and it opened this passage when I asked it to. I'm going to treat it the way I treat every artifact, with respect, with patience, and with the assumption that understanding it is more important than controlling it. If anyone wants to stay out here, I won't think less of you." Nobody moved. Nobody stayed behind. She stepped through the threshold. The air inside was different. Warmer, drier, carrying a faint electrical charge that made the fine hairs on her forearms stand up. The glyphs on the floor lit as she walked, tracing her path in white light, each step triggering a new ring of activation on the concentric circles around the central platform. The structure at the center, she could see it clearly now, and the only word her professional vocabulary could produce was engine responded to her movement. Panels along its flanks opened. Internal lights cycled through sequences that suggested systems coming online for the first time in geological ages. The air around it shimmered with energy her instruments had no category for. It was approximately 40 meters tall, built from materials she couldn't identify, not stone, not metal, something between the two, with a grain like petrified wood and a sheen like polished obsidian. It was covered in the same script as the wall, and it was waking up. She climbed the 3 steps to the platform. The engine towered above her, close enough to touch, its surface etched with script that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She could feel the warmth radiating from it, steady and patient, like the heat of a body that had been sleeping and was now beginning to stir. The scale of the chamber hit her fully only when she turned to look back the way she'd come. The threshold was a small bright rectangle in a wall that curved away in both directions into shadow. The ceiling, she could see parts of it now, as the engine's light reached upward, was vaulted, ribbed with structural members as thick as bridge cables, each rib carved with its own line of script. The chamber was easily 200 meters in diameter. It had been excavated or grown, or fabricated by processes she couldn't name from the bedrock of the plateau, sealed beneath 9,000 years of Valkyrie civilization, and it had waited in the dark with a patience that made the stone it was carved from look impetuous by comparison. She noticed details that a less practiced eye might have missed. The floor around the engine's platform wasn't smooth. It was terraced, concentric rings stepping down from the platform's base, each ring approximately half a meter wide, each carved with a different set of glyphs. The outermost rings were dark. The innermost rings, the ones she'd walked across, were blazing with white light. Between the dark outer rings and the lit inner rings, there was a band of glyphs that were flickering, not steady, not dark, flickering as though they were trying to activate but couldn't quite commit. Marin filed the observation. The flickering band corresponded, roughly, to the area of the floor that was approximately 15 meters from the engine, the boundary between what the engine could reach and what it couldn't, or perhaps the boundary between what it would activate for her and what required something more. The expedition team arrived behind her. She heard their footsteps, their gasps, the clatter of equipment cases being set down too hard by hands that had forgotten to be careful. Tessara went straight to the floor glyphs, kneeling beside the concentric rings with her tablet already recording. Felk aimed his instruments at the engine, and his 4 eyes went wider than Marin had ever seen them. "Dr. Calloway." His voice was barely audible over the engine's harmonic. "The power output from this structure, even in what appears to be a startup sequence, exceeds the total energy generation capacity of every installation on Primus Tertia combined." "By how much?" "By a factor of approximately 11,000. A murmur ran through the team. Marin let it pass. She was studying the engine's surface, running her eyes over the script, and she noticed something that Tessara hadn't catalogued yet. Not all the glyphs were the same age. The ones near the base of the structure were the oldest, matching the wall's script exactly. But higher up, the carvings became progressively newer, still ancient by any reasonable measure. But the machining was subtly different. The symbols slightly evolved, as though the engine had been maintained over the centuries, tended by hands that understood it but weren't quite the same hands that built it. Someone had serviced this machine. For 200,000 years, someone or something had come to this chamber and worked on this engine, maintained it, kept it ready, and then stopped. The most recent carvings near the top of the structure were the sharpest and least weathered. Marin estimated their age at perhaps 10 or 15,000 years, roughly, the lifespan of the Valkyrie civilization that had built its cities above this chamber, without ever knowing it was here. The Valkyrie, whose oldest sacred texts described the southern plateau as the place where the builders slept. Marin circled the entire platform, documenting every face, every panel, every visible mechanism. On the platform's eastern face, set into the engine's base, she found what she'd been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. An interface, a flat panel of the same dark stone with a shallow depression shaped like a human hand, not approximately shaped, exactly shaped. 5 fingers, the right proportions, the right spacing, the right depth. A handprint designed for a human hand, carved into a machine that had been sealed for 200,000 years. She counted 4 additional interfaces around the platform. 3 were locked behind stone panels that showed no seam or hinge. One was shattered, the handprint depression cracked through the middle as if struck by an enormous force, damage so old it had acquired its own patina of geological time. Marin knelt beside the shattered interface and studied the damage. The crack pattern was radial, originating from a central impact point, as though something had struck the handprint with tremendous concentrated force. Not natural damage, not geological stress. This had been done deliberately. Someone, at some point in the engine's history, had tried to destroy an interface. She ran her fingers along the edge of the crack. The stone was cold here, the only cold surface she'd found in the chamber. Whatever had shattered this panel had killed its connection to the engine systems. Dead stone. Inert. The way every artifact she'd ever studied had been before today. Felg, come look at this. The geologist examined the shattered panel with practiced eyes. Impact damage. Single point of concentrated force, based on the fracture pattern and the material's resistance properties. He trailed off, recalculating. Dr. Calloway, the force required to crack this material would be approximately equivalent to a directed kinetic strike from an orbital platform. This wasn't done by hand. This was done with a weapon. Someone tried to break the engine. Someone tried to break one of its access points, and they succeeded for this interface. But the other 3 locked panels suggest the engine responded by sealing the remaining unused interfaces. A security measure. It protected itself. 1 working interface. 1 handprint. 1 chance. The engine had been attacked at some point in its history, had lost 1 interface to the attack, and had locked down the rest, leaving only one, the one facing east, the one pointing toward the section of wall where the builder's signature was carved, the one that had waited through violence and silence and geological time for the right hand to find it. 1 working interface, 1 handprint, 1 chance to get this right. Tessara. The floor glyphs, are they responding to anyone else? The xenolinguist looked up from her position by the concentric rings. Her eyes were wet. No, I walked the same path you did. Nothing activated. Kelly's tried, Felk tried, Hendon tried. The rings only light for you, Dr. Calloway. Marin looked at the handprint. Then she looked at her own hand, scarred across the palm from a rock saw accident on Keth, calloused along the finger pads from decades of brush work and trowel work, stained under the nails with the mineral dust of 100 dig sites. A digger's hand, a builder's hand, though she'd never thought of it that way before. Felk, what happens to the power readings if I touch the interface? My instruments are already at the edge of their measurement range. Best guess, the readings go off every scale I own. Everyone clear the platform. Move to the chamber walls. Tessara, keep your recorder running. Felk, if the power readings do anything that looks dangerous, anything at all, you say so immediately. Define dangerous. Use your judgment. You've got 4 eyes. That's twice the danger detection capacity of anyone else in this room. The faintest ghost of a smile crossed the Dreveny's face. Understood, Dr. Calloway. They moved. Marin watched them go, 23 people retreating to the curved walls of the chamber, finding positions behind equipment cases and structural pillars, setting up cameras and scanners at safe distances. Tessara took a position directly across from the platform, her tablet held steady, her recorder running. Hendon stationed himself near the threshold, one hand on his radio, ready to call for evacuation through the newly reopened shaft if anything went wrong. She waited until the platform was empty except for herself, standing alone beside the engine, beside the handprint that had waited 200 millennia for a hand shaped exactly like hers. She placed her hand in the depression. The chamber answered with everything it had. Every glyph on every surface ignited simultaneously. The engine's harmonic tone rose to a pitch that sent loose equipment skidding across the chamber floor and pressed the documentation team against the walls. The star chart, because that was what it was, Marin understood now. A star chart so vast it dwarfed anything her species had ever produced, expanded until it filled the entire chamber, surrounding her in a sphere of slowly rotating light. She stood at the center of a galaxy rendered in blue-silver fire, watching network lines pulse outward from Primus Tertia to 100 other nodes, each one flaring to active status as the system recognized its architect's hand on the controls for the first time in epochs. The nodes were real locations, a structure buried under ice on a world she recognized from survey data, a mechanism embedded in the core of an asteroid that had been classified as navigationally insignificant, a sealed vault on a moon that 3 different species had fought wars over without ever managing to breach, dozens of them, hundreds, all connected, all waiting, all keyed to the same 5-fingered handprint. Felk's voice carried across the chamber, tight with something between awe and alarm. The network you've activated, if these readings are accurate, the combined energy output of every node exceeds the total energy production of every known civilization in the outer corridor, combined, by several orders of magnitude. Hendon's voice came from the threshold, strained but controlled. Surface camp is receiving signals. Dr. Calloway, the surface monitoring station, is reporting electromagnetic pulses originating from beneath the plateau. The pulses are being detected by orbital sensors. The governance authority's traffic control is hailing us. They want to know what we've activated. Tell them the truth, Marin said, without taking her eyes off the star chart. Tell them we've found a pregalactic construction network and we've just turned it on. A pause, then Hendon's voice, quieter, understood. But Marin was no longer listening. She was looking at the center of the network, at a projection that had just resolved into clarity, and her breath had stopped. Earth. Not as she knew it, not the blue marble of satellite imagery. Earth as it had been 200,000 years ago, rendered in the builder's precise schematic language. Earth with structures on its surface that didn't exist in any geological record, structures that looked like the engine she was touching, scaled up to planetary dimensions. Earth as a hub, a nexus, the central node of the entire network, the point from which the architects had built outward into the galaxy, and the point to which they had eventually returned. A new message formed on the engine's surface, the script flowing like water to arrange itself at her eye level. The threshold stands ready. The architect has returned. Returned, not arrived, not discovered, returned, as though she had been here before, as though her species had been here before in this chamber at this interface with this machine, building something so vast it spanned the spaces between stars. Tessara, Marin's voice came out rough. The recurring conditional sequences you identified, the if-then structures in the wall's script, can you read them now? The xenolinguist was already at her tablet, fingers flying, tears running down her face. Yes, the activation sequence is providing context. The conditionals are identification protocols. They describe the criteria the system uses to identify its authorized operator. She looked up. The criteria are specific, extremely specific. A bipedal carbon-based organism, approximately 1.4 to 2.1 meters in height, bilateral symmetry, pentadactyl limb terminations, and a neurological architecture optimized for spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and her voice broke, creative construction. That's a human. That is a human. Dr. Calloway, the builders of this machine designed it to be operated by a human. 217,000 years ago, someone built a construction network spanning the galaxy and keyed every lock, every threshold, every interface to a human hand. Humanity hadn't evolved in isolation. They hadn't stumbled into space as newcomers, as latecomers, as the young species blinking in the light of civilizations that had been old when Earth's oceans were still cooling. Humanity had been here before. Builders, architects, the species that had designed the tools and walked the thresholds and then, for reasons the script might eventually explain, had stepped back, had returned to their origin world, had forgotten. And the tools had waited, with a patience that made geological time feel hurried. They had waited for the builders to grow again, to relearn, to produce someone with the right hands and the right patience, and the right reverence for what endures. Marin lifted her hand from the interface. The projections held. The network stayed active. Whatever she'd started didn't need her constant contact to run. The system was operating on its own, executing a 200,000-year-old startup protocol, bringing itself fully online for the first time since humanity's ancestors had walked away from the stars. Around the chamber, the flickering band of floor glyphs she'd observed earlier had gone fully active. The engine's reach had extended. It was spreading outward through the concentric rings, each ring lighting as the system powered up, and she could see the activation wave moving toward the outer walls of the chamber. Panels she hadn't noticed seamless, hidden, indistinguishable from the wall surface until the light reached them slid open around the chamber's circumference, revealing alcoves. Dozens of alcoves, each containing something different. Storage bays, she realized. Tools, equipment, materials. The builder's workshop, preserved intact. Every piece of inventory maintained in working order by the same automated systems that had kept the engine ready for its operator's return. Hendon walked to the nearest alcove and stopped, staring at what was inside. Dr. Calloway. You should see this. Marin crossed to where he stood. The alcove contained a set of objects she could only describe as instruments, elongated, elegant, made from the same dark stone-metal hybrid as the engine, each one fitted with a grip shaped for a human hand. They looked like tools, precision instruments, the kind an engineer or a mason might use for fine detail work. Each one hummed faintly, alive with the same energy as the engine. She picked one up. It weighed nothing. Or rather, it weighed exactly what it should to be comfortable in a human hand, balanced, responsive, warm to the touch. The grip molded itself to her fingers as she held it, not physically reshaping, but adjusting some quality of its surface that made it feel as though it had been made specifically for her hand. Which she understood now it had been. She set the instrument down carefully, photographed it, cataloged it, and moved to the next alcove. And the next, and the next. Each one contained different tools, different instruments, different components, all human-scaled, all active, all waiting. An entire workshop, purpose-built for hands like hers, sealed and preserved across an interval of time that dwarfed the combined age of every civilization she'd ever studied. She looked at the projected star chart, at Earth glowing at its center, at the hundreds of dormant nodes pulsing their way toward full activation, and she felt something settle inside her. Not fear, not triumph, something quieter. Something that felt like the moment at the end of a long excavation, when the last layer of sediment comes away, and the artifact beneath it is exactly what the evidence predicted it would be. Recognition, the oldest kind, the kind that doesn't surprise you because some part of you has always known. Over the next 3 days, Marin and her team mapped the chamber systematically. The alcoves numbered 112, arranged in 8 radial sections around the engine. 7 sections contained tools, instruments, and construction components. The 8th section was different. It contained records. Not digital records, not electronic storage. Physical records, thin sheets of the dark stone material, each one etched with the builder's script in lines so fine they were barely visible to the naked eye. Tessara, when she saw them, actually sat down on the chamber floor, put her head between her knees, and breathed carefully for 2 full minutes before she could speak. "These are manuals," she said, her voice raw. "Dr. Calloway, these are construction manuals, technical documentation, operating procedures, installation guides." She held up one of the thin stone sheets, tilting it so the glyph light from the floor illuminated the etchings. "There must be thousands of them, tens of thousands. This is the complete technical library for the network. Everything the builders knew about how to build and maintain these systems. Everything." Marin looked at the sheets, at the etched script, at the library of knowledge that had been preserved in stone, because stone endures when everything else fails. The builders had known that whoever came to reactivate the network would need to learn from scratch. They had left the textbooks. The implication was staggering, and Marin felt the weight of it settling onto her shoulders like a physical load. This wasn't a relic. It wasn't a monument to a dead civilization. It was a toolbox and a training manual and a set of keys, left by people who had walked away from the greatest construction project in the galaxy's history, and who had trusted across an ocean of time, so vast it defied human comprehension, that their descendants would come back, find the tools, read the manuals, and finish the work. Felk brought her another piece of data on the 3rd evening. The energy readings from the network nodes had stabilized, and he'd been able to refine his calculations. "The network isn't a weapon," he said, his 4 eyes solemn. "I've been analyzing the energy distribution patterns. The nodes aren't configured for directed output, no beam weapons, no shields, no offensive capability that I can identify. They're configured for," he paused, searching for the word in a language that didn't have one for what he was describing, "for shaping, for moving mass at a planetary scale, for constructing things between stars. Bridges, Dr. Calloway. The network builds bridges. Bridges between stars, roads across the galaxy, infrastructure on a scale that made planetary engineering look like carpentry. The architects hadn't been warriors or conquerors. They had been builders, and they had left their tools for the next generation of builders to find." Marin spent that evening alone on the platform, sitting cross-legged beside the engine, her journal open on her knee, working through the implications. If the network's purpose was construction, if these nodes were designed to move mass between star systems, to build structures at interstellar scales, then the bridges Felk described weren't metaphorical. They were literal, physical connections between worlds, transit corridors, the kind of infrastructure that would allow civilizations to move freely across the galaxy without the limitations of conventional faster-than-light travel. The builders hadn't just been architects. They had been road builders. They had been laying the foundation for something that every spacefaring civilization had dreamed of since they'd first looked at the stars. A galaxy connected not by the accident of proximity, but by design, by intent, by the patient, deliberate work of hands that built because building was what they did. And they had stopped. They had laid the foundation, built the tools, mapped the routes, and then they had gone home. Back to Earth. Back to forgetting. They had left the network dormant and the thresholds locked and the tools in their alcoves, and they had trusted with a faith that Marin found almost unbearable to contemplate that their descendants would eventually find their way back. 217,000 years. That was the depth of their trust. 217,000 years of silence, of waiting, of a machine maintaining itself in perfect readiness for the day when a human hand would find the interface and press it home. She wrote in her journal, "They believed in us. Across a span of time that makes civilizations look like weather patterns, they believed we would come back. And we did. Not because we remembered, because we're builders, because we can't help it. Because when we see something broken or dormant or unfinished, we reach for it. That's the qualification. That's what the interface was testing. Not bloodline, not destiny. Just the instinct to reach for what needs building." She closed the journal and sat with the engine's warmth against her back and the star chart turning slowly overhead, and she felt, for the first time in a long career of careful observations, that she was not observing. She was participating. She was part of the artifact. She was the component that had been missing, the piece that the builders had known would eventually arrive, and now that she was here, the machine was complete. The Valkyrie Governance Authority arrived 4 days later. A delegation of 17 officials representing 9 species, escorted by a security detail that looked deeply uncomfortable being underground. The news had traveled fast Hendon surface communications, restored the moment the wall opened, had reached the authority within hours, and from there, the report had spread across the sector with the speed of things that change everything. Marin met the delegation at the threshold and walked them through the findings with the same steady, methodical precision she brought to every site report she'd ever filed. She showed them the wall, the chamber, the engine, the handprint interface, the network projection, the star chart with its hundreds of nodes stretching across the galaxy, with Earth burning at its center like a lantern in a vast and patient darkness. She did not show them fear or arrogance or triumph. She showed them what she'd found, and she told them what it meant, and she did it with the calm authority of a woman who had spent 31 years learning to let the evidence speak for itself. The delegation's senior member was a Valkyrie elder named Krentoles. Tall, angular, silver-eyed, with the formal bearing of a species that measured dignity in centuries. He stood before the engine for a long time after Marin finished speaking, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the turning projections overhead. "For 9,000 years, he said finally, we have called the southern plateau sacred. We have forbidden excavation. We have guarded the ground above this chamber without knowing what lay beneath it." He turned to Marin. "We were guarding it for you. You were guarding it for whoever came to understand it." "No," Toles shook his head. "Our oldest records, the ones predating our written history, carved into the foundation stones of our first cities, they describe this place. They describe the door that would not open and the builders who would return and the sign by which we would know them." He looked at the handprint interface, then at Marin's hand. The sign was always a hand, 5 fingers in proportions we had never seen in any species we knew, reaching for what it had built. He paused. The chamber hummed around them, patient and vast. "Our records also describe what happens next," Toles continued. "The builder does not take. The builder asks." Marin met his silver gaze, and she saw in his eyes what she recognized from every elder keeper she'd ever worked with at sacred sites across the corridor. The expression of someone who has guarded something all their life without fully understanding it, and who is now watching it fulfill the purpose they always believed it had. "Elder Toles," she said, "I'd like to request an expansion of the dig permit, full access to the secondary chamber, with Valkyrie observers present at all operations, joint documentation, shared findings. I'd like to formally propose that this site be established as a protected research zone under multi-species jurisdiction. And I would like to invite every species represented in this delegation to participate in the work ahead. Dr. Calloway, the faintest trace of a smile on that angular face. You are standing inside a machine that was built for your hand. I do not think you need our permission. I do, she said, because that's how building works. You don't do it alone, and you don't do it without the people who have been guarding the ground. Tolles was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, the delegation, 17 officials, 9 species, every one of them staring at the human woman who stood on a platform beside a machine older than their combined civilizations, waited. Then the Valkyrie elder inclined his head. A deep, formal inclination, the gesture reserved in Valkyrie culture for those who had earned it through acts of enduring patience and unmistakable purpose. The permit is granted. The Valkyrie will stand beside you. He paused. And Dr. Calloway, on behalf of 9,000 years of guardianship, welcome home. The other delegation members stepped forward, one by one. A Tessarine scholar whose species had carved the word deep makers into the walls of their oldest temples, bowed in a gesture Marin had only read about in ethnographic texts. A Kethian observer, massive and silent, pressed both of his broad palms together, the Kethian sign for a promise witnessed and honored. A Dreveni diplomat, a distant relative of Felk, by the clan markings produced a small stone from an inner fold of his robes and placed it on the platform at Marin's feet. It was old, incredibly old, and carved on its surface, barely visible, was a 5-fingered handprint. My people have carried this since before we had a written language, the diplomat said quietly. We were told it was a promise, that the hand would come back for it. Marin picked up the stone. It fit in her palm as though it had been carved for her grip, which she understood now it had been. She held it for a moment. Then she set it carefully beside the engine's interface panel, in a depression she hadn't noticed before, a small hollow in the stone that was exactly the right size and shape to hold it. The stone clicked into place. A new set of glyphs illuminated on the engine's surface, a small cluster, local, specific, like a footnote referencing a page in the technical library. Tessara, already working her tablet, translated the new glyphs in under a minute. Her voice was steady when she spoke, but her hands were not. It says, the guardian stone has returned to the threshold. The count is now 2 of 217. 215 remain. 217 guardian stones, distributed across the galaxy, entrusted to species who had been charged with keeping them until the builders returned. 2 had been recovered. 215 were still out there, scattered across worlds and civilizations and sacred traditions that suddenly, vertiginously, had a common purpose none of them had known they shared. The delegation members looked at each other. Marin could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. Diplomats and scholars and keepers of ancient traditions, all of them realizing at the same moment that their respective civilizations' oldest myths and most sacred relics were not separate stories. They were chapters of the same story, pieces of the same machine, and the machine was waking up. A Tessarine scholar stepped forward, her delicate hands clasped at her chest. The Deep Maker's Covenant, she said, our oldest temple text. It describes a stone entrusted to us by the builders to be kept until the hand returns to the door. We have one. It sits in the Temple of First Foundations in Tessara Prime. We thought it was symbolic. The Kethian burial mounds, said one of the massive Kethian observers, speaking for the first time since the delegation had entered the chamber. His voice was deep, resonant, and surprisingly gentle. The central mound. There is a stone at its heart that we are forbidden to remove. It has the same mark. One by one, delegation members reported similar stories. A sacred stone held in a Dreven undersea vault, a relic embedded in the wall of an ancient Pelosi observatory. a fragment carried by the nomadic Rithani traders who wandered the corridor's outer reaches and claimed to be custodians of something they called the promise of the road. 15 guardian stones accounted for in the first 10 minutes of conversation. 15 species who had carried a piece of the builder's legacy without knowing what it was. 15 traditions that had preserved a fragment of an incomprehensibly vast plan because something in their oldest stories had told them it mattered. Marin listened. She catalogued, and deep in her chest, beneath the professional composure and the scientist's discipline and the steady, practiced calm of a woman who had spent her life among artifacts, she felt something crack open. Not fear, not awe, something warmer than either. Something that felt like gratitude for the 9,000 years of Valkyrie guardianship, and the tens of thousands of years of Tessarene temple-keeping, and the geological ages of patient, purposeful protection by species who had never known what they were protecting or why. They had kept faith, all of them, across gulfs of time and culture and species. They had kept faith with a promise they didn't understand because the builders had asked them to, and the asking had been enough. Marin nodded. She turned back to the engine, to the star chart, to the network of dormant wonders stretching across the galaxy, each node waiting for the touch of a human hand. She opened her journal to a fresh page. She clicked her pen. The sound was small and precise in the enormous chamber, a tiny mechanical snap that had no business being audible against the harmonic of a machine that could power civilizations, and yet the sound was the truest thing in the room, because Marin Calloway was, before anything else, a woman who wrote things down, who recorded, who documented, who built understanding one careful observation at a time, the way the builders of this machine had built their network one node at a time, across distances and timescales that made individual lives look like sparks. She wrote what she'd been building toward all day, all week, all her career. Not a report, not a catalog entry, a plan. The kind of document that architects produce when they look at a foundation and see, for the first time, what it was designed to hold. Coordinates, timelines, the names of the people she would need: scientists, engineers, linguists, diplomats, and diggers, always diggers, because the first step of building anything was understanding what the ground already contained. The engine hummed its steady harmonic. The chamber glowed. The expedition team worked around her, documenting and scanning and cataloging. The Valkyrie delegation stood at the edges of the space, watching the projections turn overhead, and on their angular faces, Marin saw the same expression she felt in her own chest. The solemn, quiet wonder of people who have just discovered that the universe is larger and older and more purposeful than they knew, and that the ground they stand on was prepared for this moment by hands that thought in centuries. She wrote the coordinates of every node the star chart had revealed. She wrote the names of the species who carried guardian stones. She wrote preliminary timelines for expeditions to confirm the other nodes, to retrieve the remaining stones, to begin the long, patient work of understanding the construction manuals that Tessara had found in the 8th alcove. She wrote staffing requirements and equipment lists and communication protocols and political considerations, because a project this size would require more than science. It would require diplomacy, trust, and the kind of sustained cooperation that civilizations had always found difficult and always found essential. She realized, doing exactly what the builders had done, planning across timescales that exceeded any individual life, building something that would take generations to complete, setting the foundation for a project that her grandchildren's grandchildren might still be working on. The builders had understood this. That was why they'd left the manuals in stone, because stone endures, because the work was too important for any medium that could decay. When she finally stopped writing, the journal was half full of her tight, precise handwriting, and the chamber had settled into a steady operational rhythm. The engine startup sequence was complete. Every node across the galaxy pulsed in a slow, synchronized pattern, like a heartbeat, like a signal, like a machine the size of the stars taking its first full breath in 200,000 years. Marin stood on the platform, her hand resting on the engine's warm surface, and looked up at the star chart. Earth glowed at its center, bright and steady, the hub of something so vast it made every structure her species had ever built look like a child's first sketch. She was 63 years old. She had arthritis in her left knee and 2 ex-husbands, and a field journal that was running out of pages. She was not a warrior, not a queen, not a chosen one in any sense that mythology would recognize. She was a scientist who had spent her entire adult life with her hands in the dirt, learning the language of things that endure. And the oldest machine in the galaxy had looked at those hands and said, You are the one we built this for, architect of the threshold, welcome back. Marin Calloway, doctor of xenoarchaeology, fellow of the Outer Corridor Institute, pressed her palm flat against the engine's surface and felt the galaxy's oldest threshold recognize its builder. I'm here, she said quietly, to the engine, to the wall, to the network of dormant wonders stretching across the stars, to the builders who had left them 200,000 years ago, trusting that someone would come back. Let's see what we left behind. The engine answered, not in words, in light, in warmth, in a harmonic tone that resonated in her bones and told her, with the certainty of stone and the patience of geological time, that the work was not finished, had never been finished, had only been paused the way a builder pauses at the end of a long day, setting down her tools, knowing she'll pick them up again in the morning. The morning had come, and the architect was ready to build. The first expedition launched 11 days later. Marin chose the closest node, a structure embedded in the ice shelf of Pellerin 7, a frozen world on the inner edge of the corridor that had been surveyed twice and dismissed as geologically inert. The star chart showed it as a secondary hub, one of 12 that connected directly to the Primus Tertia engine. If the network was a road system, Pellerin 7 was the next intersection. She took a small team, Tessara, because the script would need reading, Felk, because the energy readings would need measuring, Hendon, because someone had to keep track of supplies and remind everyone to eat, Kelly's, because the young Tessarine had volunteered before anyone else, and because Marin remembered being 24 and desperate to see what came next. And 3 Valkyrie observers, assigned by Elder Tolles, who stood at the landing pad as the transport lifted off, and watched them go with silver eyes that held 9,000 years of expectation. Pellerin 7 was exactly as cold as advertised. The surface temperature was -63 Celsius, the atmosphere was thin enough to require full-pressure suits, and the ice shelf where the node was located extended in every direction to a flat white horizon broken only by the distant silhouettes of geological formations that looked, in the thin blue light of the system's pale sun, like the ruins of a frozen city. Felk located the node within 3 hours of landing. It was buried under 40 meters of ice, but the energy signature was unmistakable, the same harmonic frequency as the Primus Tertia engine, pulsing in the slow, steady rhythm that Marin had come to recognize the way she recognized her own heartbeat. They drilled. The ice yielded reluctantly, fighting every meter, and Marin spent the boring hours of thermal drilling reviewing the construction manuals that Tessara had begun translating. The manuals were methodical, precise, written with the clarity of engineers who expected their readers to be starting from scratch. They described the network's architecture in terms that Tessara was slowly mapping to modern engineering concepts, load-bearing structures that distributed gravitational force across interstellar distances, energy conduits that channeled power from stellar cores, transit corridors that compressed the space between nodes into something a ship could cross in hours instead of months. The builders had not been modest. They had looked at the distance between stars and decided it was a problem to be solved by construction, the way a river was a problem to be solved by a bridge. They had designed roads, real, physical, traversable roads, laid across the vacuum between worlds, anchored at each end by a node like the engine on Primus Tertia, maintained by automated systems that had been running without interruption for 200 millennia. The drill broke through on the second day. Marin descended the bore shaft in a harness, dropping through 40 meters of compressed ice into a chamber that the builders had carved from the bedrock of a frozen world, and then sealed with a precision that had kept it dry and warm and stable, while glaciers formed and reformed above it across geological ages. The chamber was smaller than the one on Primus Tertia, 30 meters across instead of 200. The engine at its center was proportionally reduced, a structure the size of a large vehicle rather than a building, but the design was identical. The same dark stone metal material, the same spiraling script, the same concentric floor rings, the same handprint interface set into the base of the engine, waiting. The glyphs were dark, the engine was dormant. Unlike the Primus Tertia wall, this node hadn't sensed her approach from a distance. It sat in its chamber like every other artifact she'd ever excavated, silent, cold, ancient, and apparently dead. But Marin knew better now. Dead and dormant were not the same thing. She'd learned that lesson in the most personal way possible. She placed her hand on the interface. The chamber answered. Not with the overwhelming cascade of the primary engine. This was smaller, more contained, a local response rather than a galactic one. The floor rings lit in sequence, rippling outward from the platform. The engine's surface warmed under her palm. The glyphs ignited in their gold-white light, running up the structure's flanks in patterns that Tessara, kneeling beside the nearest ring with her tablet already recording, recognized immediately. "It's handshaking," the xenolinguist said, her breath fogging in the residual cold. "It's connecting to the primary network, establishing a link to Primus Tertia." A projection formed above the engine, not the full galactic star chart but a local map. 2 points of light connected by a single line, Primus Tertia and Pellerin 7. The line pulsed, strengthened, and then stabilized into a steady glow. "The first road," Felk said. His 4 eyes were fixed on his instruments, and his voice carried a tremor that Marin had never heard from him before. "Dr. Calloway, the transit corridor between these 2 nodes has just initialized. Based on these readings, the corridor is functional. It's compressing approximately 9 light-years of intervening space into a traversable distance of approximately 1,400 kilometers. 9 light-years, reduced to 1,400 kilometers, a distance that conventional ships covered in weeks, compressed to something a shuttle could cross in minutes. The first road." Marin looked at the glowing line connecting the 2 points of light and thought about the construction manuals, about the hundreds of nodes spread across the galaxy, about the 217 guardian stones scattered among species who had kept them safe without knowing why. If each node connection compressed interstellar distance the way this one did, the completed network would transform the galaxy from an ocean of impassable distances into something more like a continent, a place where the spaces between stars were not voids but corridors, not barriers but pathways, not empty but built. She pulled her hand from the interface. The projection held, steady and patient, the way all the builder's systems held once activated. She climbed back up the bore shaft into the flat white light of Pellerin 7 frozen surface, and she stood in the wind and looked at the sky and felt the scale of what she'd inherited settle onto her shoulders like a weight she was built to carry. 63 years old, a career spent in dust and stone. 2 ex-husbands who'd said she loved dead things more than living people, and they hadn't been entirely wrong. A body that ached in the mornings, and a mind that had never once stopped reaching for the next layer, the next chamber, the next artifact that would make the picture a little clearer. She had spent her whole life preparing for this without knowing she was preparing. Every dig, every collapsed tunnel, Every season of patient brushwork on fragments that most people would have dismissed as rubble. She had been training her hands for the interface and her mind for the scale and her stubbornness for the duration. The builders had known. Across the incomprehensible gulf of 200,000 years, they had known that the person who would restart their work would not be a warrior or a king or a prophet. It would be someone who had spent a lifetime learning to be patient with stone. Someone who understood that the most important discoveries were made not by force, but by persistence. Not by genius, but by the willingness to keep digging when everyone else had gone home. A digger, a builder, an architect in the oldest and most literal sense of the word. The Valkyrie observers had followed her to the surface. They stood a respectful distance away, their angular faces turned toward the horizon, where the pale sun cast long blue shadows across the ice. One of them, the youngest, a junior keeper named Sareth who had said almost nothing since joining the expedition, walked to where Marin stood and extended a hand that held a small object. A guardian stone, warm to the touch despite the frozen air, carved with the five-fingered handprint that Marin now recognized as the builder's universal sign. "Elder Tolley sent this with me," Sareth said. "He said to give it to you when the second node answered. He said you would know what to do with it." Marin took the stone. It fit her hand exactly. She descended the bore shaft again, crossed the lit chamber floor, and placed the stone in the small depression beside the Pellerin. 7 engines interfaced the same type of hollow she'd found on the Primus Tertia engine. The stone clicked home. New glyphs illuminated on the engine's surface. Tessara translated them from 30 meters above, her voice carrying down the shaft clear and steady. "The guardian stone has returned to the threshold. The count is now 3 of 217. 214 remain. 3 stones found. 214 still scattered across the galaxy, held by species who had guarded them through ages of forgetting, waiting for the hand that would bring them home." Marin climbed out of the chamber for the last time and stood in the thin, cold air of Pellerin 7 and began writing in her journal. Not observations this time. Not catalog entries or site reports or the careful empirical notations of a scientist documenting what she'd found. She wrote a letter. She wrote it to whoever would find her journal when she was gone. Because she was 63, and the work ahead would take centuries, and she would not live to see it finished. She knew this the way she knew the age of stone by its color and the depth of a ruin by the density of its sediment, instinctively, professionally, without sentiment. She wrote, "The network has 217 nodes. 3 are active. The construction manuals describe a process that will take, by the builder's own estimates, between 400 and 600 years to complete, depending on how many species participate and how quickly the transit corridors can be calibrated. I will not see the finished work. But I have seen the foundation, and I have read the plans, and I have put my hand on the interface and felt the machine recognize me, and I can tell you this. The plans are good. The foundation is sound. The tools work. And the species of this galaxy, all of them, human and otherwise, are capable of building what the architects designed, because the architects were us, and they knew we would be capable because capability is not something you inherit. It is something you build, one patient day at a time. One stone at a time, one threshold at a time." She paused. The wind moved across the ice shelf. The transport sat on the landing pad, its engines cycling, ready to carry them back to Primus Tertia, back to the primary chamber, back to the star chart and the manuals and the alcoves full of tools and the work that would outlive her. She added one more line: "Find the stones, build the roads. And when you reach a threshold that seems too vast to cross, remember that someone already crossed it once, 200,000 years ago, and left the door unlocked for you." She closed the journal. Below her, through 40 meters of ice and stone, the Pellerin 7 engine hummed in its steady rhythm, synchronized with its twin on Primus Tertia. She could feel it through her boots, a vibration so faint it was almost imaginary, almost the kind of thing a tired scientist might invent after days of insufficient sleep and too much significance. But the instruments didn't lie. The transit corridor between the two nodes was active. The first road in 200,000 years was open, and something that had been broken was now, incrementally, beginning to mend. Tessara climbed out of the bore shaft behind her, ice crystals in her hair, her tablet clutched against her chest. She stood beside Marin for a moment without speaking, looking at the flat white horizon and the pale distant sun. "The manuals describe a hierarchy of activation," she said quietly. "The secondary nodes connect to the primary engine. But there are tertiary nodes smaller, more numerous, spread between the major hubs. Each secondary node, once active, begins broadcasting a signal that wakes the tertiary nodes in its sector. The network expands outward from each activation point like." She searched for the analogy. "Like roots spreading from a planted seed." "How many tertiary nodes?" "The manuals reference approximately 1,200, give or take a century of attrition." 1,200, plus the 217 primary and secondary hubs, plus the guardian stones, each one a key to a lock that had been waiting since before the species that carried it had learned to write. The scale was beyond anything Marin had ever contemplated, beyond anything any living scientist had contemplated, and yet the builders had designed it to be assembled by hands like hers, one node at a time, one road at a time, one patient connection between 2 points of light in a galaxy full of darkness. She thought about her first dig, 22 years old, on a world whose name she'd since forgotten, brushing sediment from a fragment of ceramic that turned out to be a piece of a cooking vessel, unremarkable, mundane. But she remembered the way the fragment had felt in her hand, the weight of it, the texture, the sudden electric certainty that someone had held this object before her, had eaten from it, had set it down and walked away, and that her hands were the first hands to touch it since. That moment had defined her career. Not the grand discoveries, not the Pellos Towers or the Dreven transit halls. That first fragment, that first connection across time. The builders had understood that connection. They had designed their entire network around it, not around power or conquest or the projection of force across distances, but around the simple, fundamental act of reaching across a gap and making contact, building a bridge, closing a distance, connecting what had been separate. That was the threshold, not a door, not a gate, a connection, the space between 2 points and the decision to build across it. Hendon appeared at the bore shaft's edge, pulling himself up the last few meters with the careful economy of motion that characterized everything he did. He brushed ice from his jacket, checked his equipment manifest, and looked at Marin with the expression of a man who had worked with her long enough to know what she was thinking. "We're going to need a bigger team," he said. "We're going to need a bigger species," Marin replied. Then, before the weight of that statement could settle, "Start with the team. I want proposals for the next 3 node activations on my desk before we reach Primus Tertia. Include personnel requests, equipment manifests, and diplomatic protocols for the species whose guardian stones we'll need to retrieve." Hendon nodded, pulled out his own notebook paper, not digital because Marin's habits were contagious, began writing. 11 days since a glyph had lit on a wall before she touched it. 11 days since a 200,000-year-old machine had looked at a 63-year-old archaeologist with bad knees and scarred hands and dust under her fingernails and had said, with the certainty of stone, You are the one." Marin Calloway tucked her journal into her vest pocket, climbed aboard the transport, and went back to work. There were 214 stones still waiting, hundreds of nodes still dormant. A galaxy's worth of roads to build, and the morning light of a pale distant sun on her face, and the patient harmonic of an ancient engine humming beneath the ice, and the steady, unshakable knowledge that the builders had been right to trust. Humanity had come back, not as conquerors, not as saviors, not as the chosen ones of prophecy or destiny, as builders, as the species that looked at the space between stars and saw not emptiness but a construction site, as the people who reached for what needed building because that was what hands were for. The engine beneath the ice of Pellerin 7 pulsed its slow harmonic, synchronized now with the engine beneath the plateau of Primus Tertia, the two of them beating together like a heart with two chambers, pumping light through the first completed road in 200,000 years. The architect had returned. The work continued.